In the year 317, there was a prosperous nation called Pars. When their ally, the kingdom of Meriam, was invaded by another force, Pars sent an army of 300,000 soldiers to support them. The invading army was slaughtered on the battlefield, and it was during this time that I met Arslan, the prince of Pars. He was being trained by an old swordsman named Variz, who was also the Grand Vizier of Pars. Arslan wondered why Variz did not go to war alongside his father, to which Variz replied that his duty was to protect the main palace, as the Eastern Kingdom was also eyeing an opportunity to attack. Arslan then questioned why Variz, being so busy, still took the time to train him in swordsmanship every day. Variz explained that since Arslan had never participated in a real battle, he needed to be prepared for when that time inevitably came. Later, Arslan went to meet the soldiers and the queen. The queen gave a speech before the troops and then left. Arslan followed her and promised that he would strive to become a ruler like his father. However, it was clear that the queen had little interest in Arslan. Afterward, Arslan encountered two falcons and Kishward, the captain of the royal guard. Kishward had returned to report that the battle had been resolved and that the king was on his way back. The king soon arrived in the capital, accompanied by his cavalry and two other knight captains, Carlin and Cubard. Rumor had it that the scar over Cubard's left eye was caused by a dragon. 3 young boys watching the scene dreamed of one day joining the knights to protect the king. However, everyone knew just how strong the king was after all. He had slain a lion by himself at the age of 13. The citizens also witnessed the king bringing back prisoners of war. These prisoners came from a nation that placed their god above all else, making it a theocratic state. The people of Pars could not understand why the theocratic nation would enlist even children in their army. Arslan personally went to greet his father, but the king, confident in his own invincibility, dismissed him. At this point, it became clear why Arslan was treated coldly. He was simply too weak. Determined to learn more about the outside world, Arslan secretly ventured into the marketplace to find the theocratic prisoners. However, as soon as he approached them, he was attacked, forcing him to find another way. Meanwhile, the same group of young boys from earlier confronted a child prisoner from the theocratic nation. Unbeknownst to them, the boy had hidden a knife in his shoe. As Arslan passed by with his guards, he overheard the boy's cries for help. The young prisoner suddenly attacked Arslan's bodyguard and took one of the boys hostage. When Arslan asked him to release the boy, the prisoner instead took Arslan himself as a replacement hostage. Hearing from a slave merchant about the incident, the soldiers immediately gave chase to rescue the prince. On their way, they passed by the stable of Darion, a cavalry captain, to inform him of the situation. The young prisoner was eventually cornered and decided to escape by jumping onto a nearby stall, taking Arslan with him. The two ended up on a rooftop, where they unexpectedly encountered a giraffe. Startled, the prisoner almost fell, but Arslan managed to pull him back up. Despite having saved his life, Arslan remained his hostage. The young prisoner soon realized that Pars was an incredibly wealthy nation. Arslan explained that Pars was renowned as a center of commerce, which was why there was no hunger or poverty. They continued moving across the rooftops, and Arslan asked why the boy did not choose to become a slave, as it would at least provide him with a stable life. The boy retorted that his homeland was not impoverished to that extent. He had joined the military to serve his god, who taught that all humans were equal. To him, the people of Pars were nothing more than heretics because they practiced slavery, which degraded human dignity. He believed that if all people devoted themselves to God, there would be no more war. The two were soon forced to flee again as soldiers pursued them. Meanwhile, the king met with the queen, and it was evident that there was no real affection between them. As for Arslan and the young prisoner, they were eventually cornered by the soldiers. However, the prisoner pulled Arslan with him and leaped off the city wall, plunging into the moat below. The townspeople rescued them, but the prisoner quickly grabbed a nearby horse and fled. Darion wanted to shoot down the young prisoner, but Arslan rushed in to stop him, causing him to miss. When Darion later confronted Arslan about why he had interfered, Arslan himself didn't know, so Darion simply claimed that he had poor aim. The 3 boys were then brought in to be punished for putting Arslan in danger, and their families offered to take the punishment in their place. However, Arslan pardoned them, inspiring the 3 boys to dedicate themselves to becoming cavalrymen so they could serve as his guards in the future. Arslan began to realize that the people of the theocratic nation were different from what he had been taught. He wanted another chance to speak with them. But then he discovered that the slave merchant had killed all the remaining prisoners because they refused to submit. When Arslan returned, he could not understand why those people had refused to become slaves, but Darion assured him that one day, if Arslan became king, he would take him to meet someone who could answer all of his questions. However, Arslan believed that his father's rule was still strong and had not considered ascending the throne. Yet, 3 years later, Mariam fell to the theocratic nation, and the war quickly spread to Pars. At the age of 14, Arslan went to the battlefield himself. What had happened? Let us go back a little in time. Despite 3 years of training with Varys, Arslan's swordsmanship had not improved much. He knew that Varys wanted to encourage him, but he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He thought that he lacked real battle experience, but Varys believed that no nation would be foolish enough to start a war with Pars. Suddenly, Varys received a letter from the king, and he was visibly shocked. It seemed that war had indeed begun. Not long after, the theocratic army crushed Mariam and gradually advanced into Pars. The king personally led his army into battle, and Arslan joined him. On the battlefield, Carlin noticed that Arslan seemed anxious and reassured him that there was no need to worry. Not only was the king present, but even Varys had come to fight, along with all the knight captains and over 200,000 soldiers. On top of that, they had the advantage of fighting on home ground. However, Arslan still did not understand how the theocratic nation had managed to take Mariam. Just then, a patrolling falcon returned, and Arslan noticed that its wings were wet. Carlin decided to scout ahead, as they were unsure whether it would rain. The 3 boys from before had now become soldiers and were serving in the army. They followed Arslan to the front lines, having sworn to protect him with their lives after he spared them 3 years ago. However, Arslan wanted everyone to survive and return home. Varys later approached Arslan, advising him not to stray too far and to stay close to the camp. However, Arslan was concerned about the dense fog covering the battlefield. Varys remained confident that the king would never be defeated and suggested that Arslan move around a little to clear his mind. Suddenly, a soldier arrived, calling Varys back, as the king and Darion were arguing. Since Darion was Varys' nephew, he had no choice but to intervene. The king was furious because Darion had urged him to retreat. Being a wise man, Darion found it suspicious that the theocratic army was waiting for them on the plains, where Pars should have had the advantage. Furthermore, the thick fog was greatly hindering their allied forces. This made Darion suspect that the enemy had set a trap, so he pleaded with the king to consider withdrawing to ensure their safety. The king refused to believe that the theocratic nation knew Pars so well, but Darion suspected that they had a spy or that some escaped prisoners had revealed information about the land. However, the king dismissed Darion's words as baseless nonsense. As a result, he stripped Darion of his title as knight captain and expelled him. He then demanded to know why Arslan was even there. Varys stepped in and slapped his nephew for daring to argue with the king. He then pleaded with the king to forgive Darion, and Darion also bowed his head in apology. Reluctantly, the king gave Darion a chance to redeem himself by assigning him to the main battle formation. As Darion left, he apologized to Arslan for making him worry. However, even Carlin had hesitated about this matter, which was why Darion had stepped up to speak to the king, fully aware that he would be punished for it. Arslan was then called back to his position, while Darion noticed that the king seemed somewhat indifferent toward Arslan. Varys advised his nephew to think carefully before speaking, given his blunt nature. He then asked Darion whether Arslan resembled the queen or the king, to which Darion replied that Arslan took after his mother. Varys seemed to be contemplating something and asked Darion to swear loyalty to Arslan no matter what happened. Darion swore upon his sword, which reassured Varys. Immediately after, the signal to attack was given. The king led his army onto the plains, and Carlin reported that the area ahead had been thoroughly scouted. The enemy forces were only half their size and positioned 250 meters in front of them. The king then shouted his battle cry and charged forward with his soldiers. The theocratic army had been waiting for them with a triumphant smirk. The Parsian forces immediately fell into a ravine that the theocratic army had secretly dug in advance. As the soldiers fell, they realized that the pit was filled with oil. Without hesitation, the theocratic army rained down flaming arrows, engulfing those trapped below in flames. The Parthian army quickly descended into chaos. Taking advantage of the disorder, the theocratic forces wheeled out their tower-mounted archers and unleashed a relentless barrage of arrows. After suffering massive casualties, the theocratic army advanced for close combat. Arslan was forced to flee, while the 3 young soldiers who had once pledged loyalty to him charged into battle. Arslan encountered an enemy soldier, who knocked him off his horse. He shattered the enemy's weapon and then drove the broken spear into the soldier's horse, causing him to fall before delivering the finishing blow. This was the first time Arslan had killed someone, leaving him utterly shaken. He called out for his closest allies, but there were only corpses around him. Then, he saw that one of the 3 young soldiers who had sworn to protect him had perished. Meanwhile, Darion was searching for Arslan. Spotting an enemy soldier picking up Arslan's helmet, he rushed in to interrogate him. Arslan, however, came face to face with Karlan and quickly realized that he was a traitor when he saw him standing alongside the theocratic army. The king, having heard that Karlan had gone missing, ordered his men to search for him. Meanwhile, Karlan relentlessly attacked Arslan, stating that the boy had done nothing wrong but was simply doomed by the shifting tides of fate. Just as Karlan was about to strike, Darion arrived, charging into the enemy ranks to rescue Arslan. Earlier, Varez had instructed Darion to find and protect Arslan, assuring him that he would take responsibility if the king punished him for it. Thus, Arslan's first battle had turned into a nightmare. Darion also realized that Karlan had betrayed them and had deliberately sent him to report to the king, only for the king to strip him of his title. Karlan admitted that Darion was an exceptional warrior, which was why he needed to weaken his influence. He originally intended to overthrow the king and transform Pars into a nation with a new ideology. Karlan then decided to retreat, and Darion, unable to pursue him, stayed behind to protect Arslan. Meanwhile, Varez had convinced the king to withdraw. However, Karlan's spies sabotaged the retreat by killing the messenger and spreading false information that the king had fled. This shattered the soldiers' trust in their ruler and crushed their morale. Qubard, deeming the king a coward, chose to abandon him, while another commander, Shapur, though furious, believed that the king was merely retreating to the capital and urged everyone to regroup there. The 2 argued and even challenged each other, but with the enemy still pressing forward, they had no choice but to fight first and settle their dispute later. Within a single day, the once proud army of Pars suffered a devastating defeat. As the king and Varez withdrew, they were ambushed and struck by a hail of enemy arrows. The commander of the theocratic army, Silver Mask, emerged and praised Karlan for accurately predicting the king's retreat route. Varez led his soldiers in a desperate charge to carve a path for the king. Though he fought valiantly, he was ultimately slain in a single stroke by Silver Mask. The king, desperate to know the identity of his attacker, was told that Silver Mask had harbored a deep grudge against him for 16 years. During this time, Darion gave Arslan his horse, explaining that it was exceptionally fast and would ensure Arslan's safety in case of trouble. Darion would ride another horse instead. As they traveled, they came across a Parthian soldier and rescued him, asking about the situation. They learned that many high-ranking officers had fallen and that the king had retreated without informing the army, causing the soldiers to lose morale. Arslan worried about the king's safety, but Darion reassured him that with Varez by his side, the king would be safe. Meanwhile, Parthian forces emerged from behind a wall of fire to attack the theocratic nation's stronghold. However, this was merely their last desperate counterattack. At that moment, 2 commanders of the theocratic army began to question whether they were truly chosen by God, recalling how they had burned children and infants alive during the Battle of Marion. They wondered if the divine would bless such actions. Just then, news arrived that the king of Pars had been executed. Meanwhile, Darion decided to take Arslan to meet Narcissus, a friend he had intended for Arslan to meet before. Narcissus was once a member of Pars's council, but the king exiled him for advocating bloodless solutions to war. Since the king did not approve, Narcissus was forced to live in seclusion in the mountains. As they approached, they were suddenly attacked and forced to retreat. However, when Darion spoke up, their attacker revealed himself. It was Elam, Narcissus' apprentice. Elam then led them to Narcissus' dwelling. Darion called out to Narcissus, who soon emerged to greet them. Narcissus remarked that Darion had interrupted his painting, but Darion saw it as a blessing, given how terrible Narcissus' artwork was despite his passion for it. Darion then introduced Arslan to Narcissus, but Narcissus dismissed himself as a mere hermit unworthy of the prince's attention. He then asked Elam to prepare dinner for their guests. Arslan was taken aback by Narcissus's atrocious painting. During dinner, Darion noted that it had been 3 years since Narcissus left Pars. He took the opportunity to tell Arslan about Narcissus's past achievements. 5 years prior, 3 allied nations had attempted to invade Pars. Narcissus's father had passed away, making him the new lord. When he met the king asked where his troops were. Narcissus explained that he had freed all the slaves in his domain, reducing his army. However, he claimed to have a plan to defeat all 3 nations without needing any soldiers from the king. The king decided to trust him, and soon after, reports arrived stating that the 3 allied nations had turned against each other and the alliance had collapsed. When Arslan asked how he did it, Narcissus explained that he had released prisoners of war from one of the 3 nations and spread rumors that their country had betrayed the alliance. The rumors escalated and caused distrust among the allies, leading to internal conflict. Meanwhile, Pars took advantage of the situation and crushed all 3. Because of this brilliance, Darion wanted Narcissus to serve as Arslan's strategist. However, Narcissus claimed he had lost interest in warfare. Frustrated, Darion argued with him. After hearing the situation, Narcissus realized that the enemy's tactics indicated a highly intelligent mastermind behind them. However, he still disliked Pars as long as slavery remained. He had previously proposed abolishing slavery, which made the king despise him. Arslan remarked that if that was the case, then he and Darion were also disliked by the king for similar reasons. Hearing this, Narcissus gained a newfound understanding and agreed to support Arslan. That night, after Arslan had gone to sleep, Darion and Narcissus continued their conversation. Narcissus observed that the king had placed too much faith in his own strength, leading him to underestimate the importance of strategy. Darion hoped that Arslan would not follow in his father's footsteps. He also found it strange that Arslan had been neglected by his own parents. With Karlin's betrayal, Arslan was more consumed by sorrow than anger, and Darion's uncle must have sensed this as well, which was why he made Darion swear loyalty to Arslan. The next morning, Arslan woke up and saw Narcissus painting again. He went to Elam to see if he could help with anything, but Elam told him that simply not interfering and ruining things would be enough. Arslan then asked why Elam, despite both his parents being free, still chose to serve Narcissus. Elam replied that it was his own decision. Remembering the young prisoner he had met in the past, Arslan became even more convinced that abolishing slavery was the right thing to do. Just then, they discovered that Karlin's men had arrived. Narcissus asked which route Darion had taken to get there, quickly realizing that Darion had deliberately passed by Karlin's territory, exposing Narcissus's location to force him into this conflict. Darion, however, saw no other option now. Narcissus went out to meet Karlin's men, who, upon recognizing him, relayed that Karlin wished to recruit him. They were also searching for Arslan and Darion. Narcissus inquired about General Varys, and they falsely claimed that Varys had attempted to convince the army to surrender and was executed for it. Narcissus refused their offer, and then activated a trap, dropping them all into a pit. Turning to Darion, Narcissus asked how he wanted to deal with them, sensing Darion's anger over Varys' death. Arslan was deeply saddened by the loss of his mentor, but Narcissus decided that they would eat breakfast first and think later. During the meal, Narcissus suddenly threw a plate, causing the captives who had been trying to climb out by stacking themselves to fall back down. Darion, still grieving, had no appetite, and Narcissus remarked that thanks to Darion, they now had to find a new place to stay. At that moment, Arslan made a decision. He told Narcissus that if he joined his cause, he would be rewarded not with wealth or status, as those wouldn't earn Narcissus's loyalty, but with the thing he desired most. When Arslan became king, he would appoint Narcissus as the royal court's painter. Narcissus, amused and convinced, remarked that Arslan was nothing like an art-ignorant brute such as Darion. Darion, however, believed that making Narcissus a painter would be a stain on the nation's art. But Arslan reasoned that he would rather have Narcissus paint him than let the theocratic nation paint his memorial portrait. Before agreeing, Narcissus wanted to know if Arslan was willing to go against his own father to accept him. Arslan affirmed his resolve, and with that, Narcissus pledged his loyalty. Elam also chose to follow Narcissus, but Narcissus instructed him to prepare the horses and supplies, stating that a merchant friend at the harbor would provide him with work. However, Elaim, feeling indebted to Narcissus, refused to leave. Narcissus felt that Elaim was still too young, but in truth, Elaim handled most household tasks better than he did. Arslan, fond of Elaim's cooking, also wanted him to stay, and Darion agreed. He noted that Arslan had never had a real friend before, and hoped that Elaim would be a good companion for him. Once they were fully prepared, the group set out. Meanwhile, Carlin's men finally climbed out of the pit, only to find that their horses and supplies had been stolen. Still, they believed Arslan's group wouldn't be able to leave the mountain since their forces were stationed below. However, Arslan and his group were already hiding in a cave, waiting for the enemy to descend the mountain. Narcissus understood that Arslan was worried about the capital, but descending now meant an inevitable confrontation with Carlin. The best course of action was to wait until they left. Narcissus then devised a plan to lure Carlin's troops to an area he had prepared. He emphasized that a proper strategy must be one that even the weakest warrior could execute and still achieve victory. Overconfidence and strength while disregarding strategy would only lead to a disaster, just like the battle on the plains that Arslan would never forget. The king had never lost a battle before, which made him arrogant and always see war as the solution to every problem. If Arslan were like his father, he would leave at any time. Narcissus also warned Darion not to kill Carlin if they encountered him, as he suspected that Carlin was holding onto a significant secret. Meanwhile, Kishwash, who was guarding the border, noticed that the eagle he had entrusted to Arslan had returned. A cavalry captain named Bauman then arrived to inform Kishwash about the king's defeat and that the Holy Kingdom was now advancing toward the capital. At this moment, the Holy Kingdom had already surrounded the capital, forcing it to close its gates and defend itself. However, the high priest of the Holy Kingdom, Baden, brought the cavalry captain Shapur before the soldiers, intending to punish him as a way to demonstrate divine punishment to the people of Pars. Baden then rallied his troops to cheer, but Shapur declared that he was no heretic and had his own faith. He would rather die than submit to their wretched god. As Shapur was continuously beaten, he shouted to his fellow soldiers, urging them to shoot him with arrows, as he would rather die at the hands of his comrades than those barbaric beasts. However, no arrow could reach him. At that moment, an archer standing atop a tower fired a single arrow straight into Shapur's head, granting him release. The queen noticed this archer and ordered her attendants to bring him before her. Meanwhile, the Holy Army began their assault, setting up ladders to scale the walls and bringing forth siege towers to counterattack. The queen then met the archer, who introduced himself as Jeev, a wandering musician. He claimed to have many talents and boasted that his archery skills were on par with the queen's closest retainers. However, one of the maids accused Jeev of being a fraud, revealing that he had previously tricked her into believing he was a prince. Jeev, however, had his own way of explaining, and the queen, understanding his reasoning, did not punish him for killing Shapur. Instead, she wished to see his musical talent. Jeev then performed a song, blending music with storytelling. Impressed, the queen rewarded him with 200 gold coins, deducting some as punishment for his deception. Meanwhile, Narcissus deduced that the capital must have been attacked, but its walls were too sturdy to be breached from the outside. The only way to take it down was through internal sabotage, and the Holy Kingdom had a method for that. They began chanting, calling upon the slaves inside the capital to rise up. Soon, the slaves started rebelling en masse to seize their freedom. Their numbers far exceeded those of the nobles, meaning the situation was bound to worsen, and the capital would likely not hold for long. Narcissus remarked that no matter how urgent the situation was, the 4 of them alone could not possibly save the capital. The king should have freed the slaves before things reached this point. The next day, the Holy Army displayed the severed heads of cavalry captains who had fought in battle before the Parsian soldiers. The queen inquired and confirmed that the king's head was not among them. The 2 remaining captains inside the city noted that the queen did not even ask about Arslan, which was a testament to how dire the situation had become. They then heard news that the slaves were gradually being swayed by the enemy. One of them rushed out to drive the slaves away, fearing a rebellion. However, soon after, the soldiers reported that a group of slaves had already revolted and were trying to open the gates for the Holy Army. The bearded captain rushed forward, cutting down the traitorous slaves. Captain Sam, on the other hand, argued that killing 10 rebellious slaves would only create even more rebels. The slave owners, panicking upon hearing more reports of uprisings, realized they could not simply imprison all the slaves, as there would be no one left to work. However, the slaves had already begun killing their masters to claim their freedom. Sam was forced to meet with the queen to report that the slave uprisings were escalating beyond control, pushing the situation toward a deadlock. He proposed offering rewards and changing their treatment to pacify them. The queen believed this would weaken the foundation of the kingdom, but their enemies were already using that foundation against them. Meanwhile, Jeeves saw that things were getting worse and decided he should leave soon. He later met with the Grand Vizier, who wanted him to help with a few tasks. Jeeves noticed someone hiding behind the curtain, ready to attack if he displeased the Vizier. The Vizier then ordered Jeeves to escort the queen out of the capital through a secret passage. That night, Jeeves led the queen away, thinking that in the end, the royal family was just a bunch of cowards fleeing for their lives. At the same time, Darion asked how long they intended to stay, to which Narcissus replied that saving the capital was impossible now. Instead, their goal should be capturing Carlin, as he was currently a valuable asset to the Holy Kingdom. However, the Holy Kingdom likely did not fully trust him, so he would act separately. If they could capture him, they might uncover his reasons for betrayal. Meanwhile, Jeeves realized that the woman he was escorting was not the queen. He could distinguish people by their scent. Not knowing the Vizier's true intentions, Jeeves decided not to escort her any further. At that moment, she drew a dagger to attack him. Jeeves dodged, but she kicked him and ran off. Soon after, she encountered Silver Mask, who mistook her for the real queen. However, when she saw Carlin and respectfully addressed him, Silver Mask realized she was an imposter and killed her. Jeeves then revealed himself, displeased that a beautiful woman had been slain. The two engaged in battle, but Jeeves accidentally dropped a nearby torch, causing Silver Mask to panic at the sight of fire. Taking advantage of this, he left the soldiers to deal with Jeeves. However, after Silver Mask and Carlin departed, Jeeves single-handedly eliminated all the soldiers. He then decided to plunder the noble's wealth and take a few beauties with him before escaping. He also looted money from the corpses of the soldiers he had slain before fleeing before a larger force arrived. Meanwhile, Sam, while defending the walls, noticed the palace burning and rushed back. He discovered that the Holy Army had infiltrated through the sewers and had also freed the slaves. Soon, he confronted Carlin and confirmed that his betrayal was real. Carlin invited him to serve the Holy Kingdom, but Sam refused and tried to escape, only to be struck by an arrow from Silver Mask. At the same time, the bearded captain saw the slaves opening the gates and tried to rally his forces to stop them. However, the enemy had already breached the city, and the capital had officially fallen. The fate of the ruling figures remained uncertain. One used every trick behind dark words of welcome. Another watched the capital burn from the night sky, and one desperately sought the justice he believed in. As for Arslan's group, they had officially set out on their journey. Meanwhile, the Holy Kingdom began clearing out the capital and prepared to bring their king in. Shortly after, once the palace was fully secured, the queen was brought before the king of the Holy Kingdom. According to the two commanders, she had once been engaged to the former Grand Vizier. However, a certain king had taken her away. This king was the older brother of the current Holy King. That man had killed his own brother to claim both the throne and the queen, making her someone who brought disaster to any man she was with. Everyone was eager to see how the new king would handle her, as she was an infidel. However, the new king seemed to be growing interested in her. Soon after, a soldier arrived to report to Guiz, the Grand Vizier and younger brother of the Holy King. Guiz was managing the weapons and treasures of the palace when he heard that his brother wanted to make the Queen of Pars his wife, which infuriated him. Guiz confronted his brother, warning him about the fate of the men who had been involved with the queen. However, the king dismissed his concerns, stating that those men met their demise because they were all infidels. Guiz became even angrier when the king decided to grant a portion of the royal treasury to the high priest Baden. Later, Silver Mask visited Guiz, and the two conspired to overthrow the king and install Guiz as the new ruler. Meanwhile, Holy Army soldiers were openly extorting goods from the citizens. At this time, a boy prisoner from years ago resurfaced, searching for answers. He visited a circus, the same place where a giraffe had once been kept, to inquire about the fate of the prisoners who had remained behind 3 years ago. Meanwhile, Carlin received word that Narcissus and Arslan had escaped. Silver Mask ordered Carlin to personally handle them, as they could not allow Narcissus to keep leading them by the nose. As expected, the Holy Kingdom's generals still did not see Carlin as an ally, treating him as nothing more than a contemptible traitor. Meanwhile, the young man continued asking about the slaves he had been forced to leave behind that day, but no one had any answers. He recalled Arslan from the past and believed that Arslan might know something, but finding him now was a challenge. Nearby, a soldier noticed a girl questioning Carlin's troop movements. He informed her that Carlin was on his way to deal with the prince, then attempted to drag her away against her will. The young man saw this and followed, only to discover that the soldier had been taken down by the girl. The young man then rushed in and introduced himself as Etoile, a royal guard, but soon realized that the girl was actually a disguised young man Elam. Elam quickly tricked Etoile into being surrounded by a group of slaves and escaped. The slaves, feeling betrayed after opening the city gates for the Holy Army and receiving nothing in return, were in an uproar. Elam later reported the situation to Arslan's group. Narcissus suspected that Carlin would set villages ablaze to lure Arslan out. If Arslan continued to hide, more innocent people would die. Arslan refused to let that happen and decided to confront Carlin. Narcissus took charge of the operation. As they prepared their horses, Darion suspected that Carlin was deliberately bringing a large force to corner Arslan, and Narcissus had also deduced that Carlin had intended to do this from the start. However, if they wanted to capture the cub, they had no choice but to enter the tiger's den. Meanwhile, as Jeev traveled, he noticed a group of Holy Army soldiers passing by. Soon after, a beautiful woman crossed paths with them. Predicting that she would encounter the soldiers, Jeev decided to intervene, hoping to impress her. However, when he arrived, he found that the woman showed no fear of the soldiers. Instead, she drew a bow and took them down as she left. Intrigued, Jeev followed and called out to her, introducing himself as a musician and praising her beauty. However, she found his poetic skills rather lacking. She introduced herself as Farron, a priestess on a mission to reach the capital. Upon hearing that the capital had fallen, she realized she had no way of returning and instead needed to find Prince Arslan. At that moment, Carlin attacked a village, declaring that anyone who harbored the prince would be executed. Farron asked Jeev if he knew Arslan's whereabouts, but he claimed he did not, prompting her to leave. Jeev, however, chased after her, wanting to know why she was searching for the prince. She explained that the temple she served was established shortly after Arslan's birth and was meant to represent him. The temple's high-ranking members had sent her to find and serve Arslan, but she knew they had merely wanted to send her away out of jealousy for her talents. Jeev suggested that if she disliked the mission, she should abandon it, but Farron admitted that she genuinely wanted to find Arslan to help rebuild the kingdom and drive out the Holy Army, as she despised their barbarity. When Jeev began talking too much, Farron quickened her pace to shake him off. The two traveled together until nightfall, exchanging more conversation. Eventually, Farron agreed to let Jeev accompany her on the condition that he swore loyalty to Arslan. However, Jeev could not promise absolute allegiance. As Farron and Jeev continued, they spotted Carlin's soldiers passing by. Believing that Carlin might know something about Arslan's whereabouts, Farron decided to follow them. Meanwhile, Carlin had captured a man who had previously carried supplies for Arslan's group. The man claimed that he had been caught stealing and was punished for it. Hoping to exchange information for a reward, he revealed that Arslan was being hunted. Carlin was surprised to hear that Arslan's group consisted of only 4 people, but he suspected the man was one of Narcissus's spies. Refusing to believe his words, Carlin executed him and instead deduced that Arslan's group was heading north to rendezvous with Kishward in the east. However, as they advanced, Carlin's forces unknowingly walked into a trap set by Narcissus, who had lured them into a narrow ravine for battle. Narcissus soon encountered Farron, and upon introducing himself, she apologized upon realizing he also served Arslan. He immediately assigned tasks to both her and Jeev, trusting them as allies. Jeev, who had been hiding, was forced to reveal himself when discovered. Meanwhile, Elam handed Arslan a bow as a temporary weapon. As the battle commenced, Arslan appeared directly before Carlin. When Carlin's soldiers charged at him, Arslan shot them down with his bow, while Elam threw stones from a hidden position. Narcissus eliminated enemies from the shadows to create chaos. Farron fired arrows from the forest, and Jeev charged in on horseback for close combat. The enemy, unable to determine how many opponents they were facing, fell into panic and lost morale. Carlin personally charged at Arslan, but Elam dropped rocks while shouting Darion's name, causing the enemy troops to flee in terror. With his soldiers retreating, Carlin reached Arslan just as he ran out of arrows. Arslan demanded to know why Carlin had betrayed Pars, as he had never been mistreated. However, Carlin refused to answer and simply told Arslan to die considering him a traitor. Before Carlin could strike, Darion intervened, and the two warriors moved to a secluded area for a duel. Darion feigned an opening, prompting Carlin to attack, but he then reversed his spear and stabbed Carlin in the stomach. As Carlin stumbled, he attempted to steady himself with his spear, but ultimately fell, with the weapon piercing his throat. In his final moments, Carlin revealed that the king was still alive. He was astonished that Arslan had gathered such capable allies and became convinced that the true king would one day reclaim his throne. The group informed Arslan of the king's survival, raising the possibility that he might reunite with him. Farron then bowed before Arslan, and upon learning she was a priestess, Arslan requested that she pray for the fallen soldiers and even for Carlin. She agreed, but Jeev scoffed at the royal family's peculiar nature, finding it absurd that Arslan would pray for a traitor. While he was willing to stay for Farron's sake, he made it clear that he would leave if things took a turn for the worse. Narcissus decided to return to the capital to assess the country's situation. Meanwhile, Silver Mask confronted the king, revealing his true identity as Hermes, the son of the man the king had slain to seize the throne. This made him the king's nephew and the rightful heir of Pars. However, the king merely laughed, and Hermes departed. He later met with a mysterious figure who informed him of Carlin's defeat. The next day, Darion and Narcissus infiltrated the capital for reconnaissance. The city had suffered significant destruction. Meanwhile, the Holy King unexpectedly visited the queen to profess his love, but she remained silent, still considering herself a widow. Enraged by her rejection, Bodin declared her an infidel deserving of execution. However, since he could not act against her directly, he instead ordered the burning of all 12 million historical records of Pars stored in the palace. He deemed them demonic scriptures of heretics, believing that the people needed nothing more than the holy scriptures and faith in God to remain free of illness. Bodin then mocked the king, implying that God would not forgive a man who saw himself as supreme and married a heretical woman. Narcissus and Darion, having infiltrated the capital, witnessed the scene. Enraged, Narcissus decided to personally eliminate Bodin, leaving the matter of the king's brother to Darion. Meanwhile, Jeev and Farron spotted a group of soldiers passing through the forest they were guarding. Arslan, worried about them being alone in enemy territory, voiced his concerns, but Elam reassured him that they were highly skilled. Arslan then requested to fetch water with Elam, who allowed him to assist. However, as Arslan drew water from the well, he accidentally broke the rope, causing the bucket to fall in. Elam went to find a replacement while Arslan, feeling useless, resolved to prove his worth. While searching for a way to be helpful, Arslan saw a group of soldiers bullying a father and his child. He rushed to intervene, brandishing a hoe to threaten them, but they remained unfazed. Only when Etoile arrived did they back off, as she held the rank of squad captain. Recognizing Arslan, Etoile was shocked that he was still alive. She was now a military officer rather than a slave, confident in her position. Etoile had heard rumors that the king and prince of Pars were demons. Meanwhile, Narcissus and Darion discovered that the faith of the Holy Kingdom's people was vague and almost non-existent. Their scriptures spoke of a promised land meant for their believers, justifying their invasion and occupation. Blessings from God were nothing more than a pretext for conquest. Arslan, puzzled by this contradiction, asked Etoile why the Holy Kingdom preached equality but still treated Parsians unfairly, even after they converted. Etoile had no answer. When Elam returned, tensions rose, and the two sides were about to fight, but Arslan stopped them. Etoile chose to leave peacefully and asked about the former prisoners of war. Arslan informed her that they had perished. Having no more ties to the past, Etoile departed, handing Arslan a holy scripture to read. Later, Darion asked Narcissus about his plan for reclaiming the kingdom. Narcissus proposed freeing the slaves and using Arslan's status as prince to rally the people. However, he recognized that this would anger the slave-owning nobles, possibly worsening the situation. As they discussed their strategy, they encountered a former soldier of Carlin's army. Upon recognizing Darion, the soldier fled. Narcissus decided to step away for a moment, tracking down Carlin's remnants, who sought revenge for being outwitted before. He dealt with them single-handedly, while Darion cut off their escape, capturing one for interrogation. The captive knew nothing about the king's location, only that he was imprisoned somewhere, while the queen had attracted the Holy King's attention and received a marriage proposal. After knocking the soldier unconscious, Narcissus and Darion considered their next move. Since the king stood in the way of the Holy King's marriage, he would likely be executed soon. As they split up to gather more intelligence, Darion unexpectedly encountered Hermes. The two warriors immediately clashed. When Hermes learned Darion's name, he realized that Darion was the nephew of Varus, the man he had killed. Taunting Darion, Hermes challenged him to avenge his uncle. During their battle, Darion shattered Hermes' mask, but still could not identify him. Narcissus then joined the confrontation, introducing himself as the future royal court painter, but Hermes dismissed them as nothing more than a hunting dog and a jester. Reinforcements arrived, forcing Darion and Narcissus to retreat. As they left the capital, they marveled at Hermes' extraordinary skill and speculated whether he wore the mask to hide burns on his face or simply to conceal his identity. Upon returning to Arslan, Narcissus stated that if Arslan wished to start an uprising, he needed to demonstrate his ability to abolish the long-standing institution of slavery while also proving his integrity to earn the people's trust. However, at this moment, Arslan's priority was not formulating a strategy. Rather, he needed to determine his true objective. The group's duty was to help him achieve it. The next day, Arslan and his group were pursued by Holy Kingdom soldiers. Fortunately, Darion arrived with reinforcements, having secured the aid of a certain lord over the past few days. As they arrived at the lord's castle, Arslan noticed the abundance of slaves in the area. The lord personally greeted Arslan, expressing relief that the prince had survived after hearing about the fall of the capital. He welcomed Arslan with a lavish feast, though Jeev and the others immediately recognized his true intent to win Arslan's favor. The lord even proposed marrying his daughter to Arslan. When asked about his plans, Arslan stated his intention to abolish slavery and recruit more followers. The lord smiled outwardly, but later that night, he separated Arslan from the others, except for Farron. Darion wished to stay by Arslan's side, but Narcissus signaled him to back down. Later, the lord came to discuss matters with Arslan privately, while Narcissus and the others, aware of the separation, decided to play along for now, as making an enemy of him at this stage would be troublesome. Meanwhile, Jeev detected an intruder, only to find that it was Arslan himself, who had climbed over to relay the lord's ultimatum. He would only support Arslan if the prince married his daughter, or if he agreed to maintain the slavery system. Arslan arranged to give his answer the next day, and Narcissus advised him to be ready to leave at any moment, handling the rest himself. He instructed Jeev to escort Arslan back and deliver a message to Farron. When Jeev met Farron, he was nearly kicked out of the window before they both noticed unusual movements among the soldiers. Around the same time, Elam returned and informed Narcissus that he had found anesthetic incense in the ceiling. With reports of suspicious military activity, they began preparing for action. Soon after, the lord visited Arslan again, proposing to eliminate potential threats to his rule. Narcissus and Darion. He saw Narcissus as dangerous due to his way of thinking. However, Arslan chose to trust Narcissus over the lord, as Narcissus had provided him shelter without resorting to armed coercion. Arslan called for his group to depart, confident that the lord was wise enough not to act against them. However, as they left, the lord assigned 2 soldiers to escort Arslan's horse. Farron quickly noticed they were carrying hidden daggers and confronted the lord. At that point, the lord revealed his true colors and ordered an attack. Fortunately, everyone in Arslan's group was capable of defending themselves, and Elam had previously sabotaged the soldiers' bowstrings. Despite this setback, the lord still ordered his men to fight with swords, prompting Darion to intimidate him. When the lord attempted to strike Arslan directly, Darion was forced to kill him. With their leader dead, the soldiers lost their will to fight. As they departed, Arslan freed all the slaves in the castle. However, instead of gratitude, the former slaves resented him for killing their master. Darion had to escort Arslan away, while Narcissus had already anticipated this reaction. He had allowed Arslan to experience it firsthand, knowing that the prince would not have believed him otherwise. Though slavery was harsh, it at least provided the slaves with a means to survive. Still, Narcissus reassured Arslan, telling him not to lose heart, as his chosen path was the right one, and they would help him achieve it. Daryan then asked about their next destination, to which Narcissus replied that they would head east, toward Kishward's stronghold. Meanwhile, Gis learned that the clergy, emboldened by Baden's support, had begun indiscriminately killing people. He immediately dispatched forces to suppress them, using force if necessary. Gis then confronted Baden, warning him that his actions could incite a coup. However, Baden remained unfazed, believing that the Holy Kingdom's forces still outnumbered their enemies. Not long after, the Templar Knights serving High Priest Baden entered the capital. Meanwhile, it was revealed that Sam was still alive. He had no idea why he had been spared. Hermes approached him, asserting that he should be kneeling before him. However, Sam declared that he would only kneel before the rightful king of Pars. In response, Hermes revealed his true identity, shocking Sam, who had believed that Hermes had perished in the Great Fire 16 years ago. At this time, Arslan was still traveling a long and arduous route to avoid ambushes while heading east. Along the way, he asked Elam what kind of future he desired for himself. Elam responded that he would leave his future in Narcissus' hands. Jeev observed that Arslan was unlike any noble he had encountered, as the young prince genuinely cared for his retainers. Meanwhile, Hermes recalled the day he had proudly told his father that he had slain a lion by himself and was worthy of the throne. Yet, the king had set fire to the castle, leading to disaster for both father and son. A maidservant then approached Hermes, informing him that someone had come to see him. He soon met Xander, the son of Carlin. Xander pledged his loyalty to Hermes and sought permission to eliminate Arslan and Daryan to avenge his father. Not long after, Farron received a divine premonition of a bloodthirsty pursuer closing in on them. The group quickly decided to flee, but before long, they received news that the enemy was closing in fast. Daryan chose to stay behind and fight, while the others focused on getting Arslan to safety. However, during the retreat, Farron and Narcissus became separated from the group. Farron doubled back to assist Daryan, knowing that even he would struggle against an entire battalion alone. Together, they instilled fear in the enemy soldiers, forcing them to hesitate until Xander arrived on the battlefield. Daryan was taken aback upon learning Xander was Carlin's son. Xander wielded a massive sword and struck with such force that Farron was knocked off his horse. He then attempted to attack Daryan, but the latter dodged, causing Xander's sword to embed itself deep into a tree trunk. Yet, to Daryan's shock, Xander was powerful enough to rip the tree from its roots. Farron then returned and shot Xander's horse, taking advantage of the distraction to land a strike. He had the opportunity to kill Xander, but chose instead to incapacitate him and retreat with Farron. When Farron asked why he spared Xander, Daryan replied that he would not kill a fallen warrior. Meanwhile, Arslan's group encountered enemy soldiers. Elam urged Arslan to flee, as their foes were all infantrymen. However, Elam's horse was suddenly shot down. He told Arslan to leave him behind, but the prince chose to return and save him. Witnessing this, Jeev was moved by Arslan's character. To create a distraction, he threw 2 bags of gold, causing the enemy soldiers to scramble for them, allowing the 3 to escape. Unfortunately, they soon found themselves cornered with enemy troops closing in from behind. The soldiers assumed Arslan's group had jumped into the river and sent forces downstream to search. However, a knife suddenly flew through the air and struck their commander in the head. Arslan's group had been hiding beneath a tree the entire time. Elam apologized for putting Arslan in danger, but Arslan reassured him that he considered Elam a friend, so saving him was natural. Even so, Elam remained deeply grateful. Arslan then thanked Jeev and promised to repay him for the gold. However, Jeev now understood why Narcissus was so intrigued by Arslan. He was unlike any ordinary royal. Wanting to see what kind of kingdom Arslan would build, Jeev decided to follow him. Although Arslan's group had been scattered due to the Holy Kingdom's relentless pursuit, they all shared the same goal. The constant ambushes made Daryan increasingly worried about Arslan's safety, urging him to reunite with the prince as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Narcissus had arrived at the territory of the Zot clan, a tribe of formidable warriors. There, they came face to face with Hermes. The chieftain demanded that Hermes abandon his belongings and weapons and leave immediately. However, Hermes saw no reason to obey a barbarian and, without hesitation, drew his sword and struck down the chieftain. This act was a declaration of war against the Zot clan, prompting them to retaliate at once. However, before long, all of the Zot warriors present had been slaughtered, leaving only the chieftain's daughter, Alfried, alive. She fiercely attacked Hermes, but he merely toyed with her, acknowledging her agility but mocking the weakness of her people. Just as he was about to finish her off, Narcissus intervened. Hermes demanded that Narcissus reveal Arslan's location, but Narcissus replied that he would only speak once Hermes was dead. However, Alfried insisted that Narcissus leave Hermes to her. Narcissus pointed out that she didn't even have a weapon and, more importantly, knew full well that she had no chance of defeating Hermes. He urged her not to throw away her life in vain. The two then engaged in battle, but Narcissus quickly realized that Hermes was still far too powerful. Using his tactical prowess, he lured Hermes under a pile of precarious rocks. Recognizing Narcissus's ingenuity, Hermes offered him a position in his service. Narcissus refused, stating that Arslan would never be as arrogant as Hermes. He then triggered the rockfall and swiftly led Alfried away. The two escaped into the forest, where Alfried thanked Narcissus for saving her life. She felt fortunate that the landslide had occurred, only to realize that Narcissus had set it up in advance using a lever mechanism. Having lost her people, she decided to abandon her past and follow Narcissus, indebted to him for rescuing her. 1 month after the fall of the capital, the Holy Kingdom's internal factions had splintered into 3 main groups. First was High Priest Baden, who commanded tens of thousands of Templar Knights. Second was Gis, backed by numerous officials and soldiers. Lastly was the king, who had lost the trust of his retainers after yielding to the enemy queen. Then, a significant event took place. One of the Templar Knights' commanders was assassinated. Baden immediately blamed the king, claiming that he had ordered the killing because the commander had opposed his marriage. However, Gis argued that the commander had been executed for engaging in relations with a woman of a different faith, which was his rightful punishment. Baden refused to accept this and swore vengeance upon both the king and Gis. In response, Gis mocked the Templar Knights, saying that their lowered banner was proof of their incompetence. He then demanded that Baden withdraw his forces to avoid further disgracing himself. Furious but powerless, Baden had no choice but to retreat with his troops to Meriam. Meanwhile, Arslan's group was nearing the fortress in the east. Elsewhere, Darion once again confronted Xander. Xander declared that Darion had to pay for killing his father, but Darion insisted that the fault lay with Karlan for betraying his country. However, Xander argued that his father had done no wrong, as he had merely served the rightful heir to the throne. Before Darion could make sense of Xander's words, a sorcerer with the ability to burrow underground suddenly appeared, announcing that he had been sent by Hermes to aid Xander. Xander, unconcerned with the details, allowed the sorcerer to do as he pleased and charged at Darion. Forced to keep an eye on the sorcerer, Darion was knocked off his horse by Xander. Xander pinned him to the ground, allowing the sorcerer to strike from behind. At that moment, Arslan arrived to support Darion. Darion quickly warned Arslan about the sorcerer, but Arslan was struck and sent flying before being helped by a lamb. However, he soon recovered and lunged forward, stabbing the sorcerer. Xander attempted to attack again but was unhorsed by Darion, who pressed his spear to Xander's throat. However, Xander managed to break free and flee, only for Farron to shoot him with an arrow, sending him tumbling off a cliff. With Arslan's group now mostly reunited, they pressed onward toward the eastern fortress. Before long, they encountered Kishward, who had arrived with reinforcements to assist them. It turned out that Narcissus had arrived ahead of them, and had led Kishward's forces to this location. Without hesitation, Kishward charged into battle, forcing the enemy to retreat. The others were surprised that Narcissus had beaten them there, and were also curious about the girl accompanying him. Introducing herself, Alfried proudly declared that she was Narcissus's future wife despite the 10-year age gap between them. This eastern fortress served as a border stronghold for Pars. Since it had not participated in the defense of the capital, it now housed the largest remaining force in Pars. As Arslan's group entered, the soldiers greeted him with great enthusiasm. Darion, having been separated from the group, was unsure of what had transpired in the meantime. Jeev jokingly suggested that Narcissus had failed to resist temptation, but Narcissus clarified that he had merely saved Alfried, and she had been clinging to him ever since. Narcissus then informed Darion that Hermes had appeared, and that all the attacks on their journey here had been orchestrated by him. Arslan later reunited with Bahman and decided to launch a counterattack with the 80,000 soldiers stationed at the fortress to reclaim the capital. That night, Hermes was furious that Arslan had managed to escape at the last moment. Meanwhile, Jeev was frustrated after all his efforts to impress, only for Farron to end up spending more time with Darion. When Arslan apologized if he had upset Jeev, Jeev dismissed the concern, saying that the harder the path to conquest, the more rewarding the outcome. Elsewhere, Alfred and Elam had started arguing, as both harbored feelings for Narcissus and disliked the other constantly being around him. Alfred later complained to Farron, saying that Narcissus' efforts to rebuild the nation would only result in more nobles rising to power. Farron, however, pointed out that Alfred was well aware that Narcissus was becoming exactly the kind of man she admired, hence why she followed him so persistently. However, since Narcissus was currently focused on national affairs, Alfred first needed to prove her own usefulness. At the same time, Arslan confided in Kishward about his vision for the future, declaring that he would abolish the long-standing system of slavery. He understood that many nobles would oppose this, but he was determined to improve the nation otherwise. This war would be meaningless. Kishward respected Arslan's decision and wished for his success. However, the next morning, Bahman unexpectedly announced that they could not mobilize their troops due to unresolved issues. Narcissus, seeing through him, remarked that Bahman had never personally led a campaign and was merely looking to enjoy his twilight years in peace. After the meeting, Kishward revealed that before the battle on the plains, Bahman had received a letter after which his attitude had completely changed. Darion also recalled Varus's mysterious instruction to protect Arslan at all costs and wondered why his uncle had made such an urgent request. The truth was that Bahman had discovered a shocking secret about Arslan, and because of this, he could not bring himself to follow him. Had he remained ignorant, he might have been able to serve Arslan without hesitation. That evening, while deep in thought, Arslan stood alone atop the fortress walls only to come face to face with Hermes. Hermes had spent so much effort hunting Arslan down, and now, by sheer coincidence, he had found him standing alone without any guards. Recognizing Hermes, Arslan immediately drew his sword in defense. However, Hermes had no intention of killing him outright. Instead, he threatened to cut off his arms and legs first. Arslan was completely outmatched, tossed around effortlessly by Hermes. Desperate, he pulled out a torch, and Hermes visibly recoiled. Realizing that Hermes feared fire, Arslan pressed his advantage. Just then, Arslan's guards arrived, forcing Hermes into a battle against Narcissus, Darion, and Kishward. However, upon learning Hermes's true identity, the three hesitated, allowing him to slip past them and charge at Arslan. At that critical moment, Bahman intervened, taking the blow in Arslan's place. Shocked to see Hermes again, Bahman revealed that he had once been Hermes's mentor. He explained that he was protecting Arslan because Varys had entrusted him with this duty. Hoping for mercy, he pleaded with Hermes to withdraw. He then commanded everyone not to pursue Hermes, revealing that Hermes was the last remaining member of the Parsian royal bloodline. Before breathing his last, Bahman apologized to Arslan and expressed his wish for him to become a just king. Taking the secret that Varys had uncovered to his grave, Bahman passed away. At that very moment, an urgent report arrived the Eastern Kingdom was mobilizing its forces for an attack. While the others were thinking about how to respond, Arslan seemed somewhat unfocused on the situation ahead. He was startled when called upon and declared that they would intercept the Eastern Kingdom's army right there. We then meet Rajan, the second prince of the Eastern Kingdom. Rajan believed that Pars was in turmoil, making this the perfect opportunity. But his own kingdom was not much better off, as the king had just been deposed and the crown prince was quite incompetent. Rajan wanted to prove that he was more deserving of the throne. Meanwhile, Darion and Narcissus told Arslan to stay behind in the fortress and wait for good news from them. Although Arslan agreed, both knew that he wanted to join the battle in some way. He was too kind, but kindness alone was not enough to be king. Even though Hermes realized that Arslan was now alone with his guards away on the battlefield, he still chose to retreat instead of attempting another assassination. Dodivert, meanwhile, wondered why they were bringing only 10,000 soldiers against 50,000 enemies. Narcissus explained that they had all three crucial factors: Heaven's favor, terrain advantage, and unity. First, Heaven's favor. The enemy troops were accustomed to warm climates and would soon tire in the cold of these mountains. Second, terrain advantage. Their knowledge of the terrain allowed them to set up an encirclement strategy. Lastly, unity. The enemy suddenly discovered that the Crown Prince's army had arrived to eliminate his younger brother from the race for the throne. However, this was merely a ruse orchestrated by Narcissus to sow discord within the enemy ranks. Being surrounded by both internal and external threats threw the enemy into chaos, making them unable to fight properly. Prince Rajan and his forces were then pushed onto a frozen lake, where they became trapped. Narcissus and Daryan then confronted Rajan, seeking to take him prisoner and subdue his forces, but Rajan resisted and attempted to flee, only to be captured by Alfred. Upon being brought back to the fortress, Rajan was presented before Arslan. Arslan requested a negotiation, but Rajan, bound in ropes, argued that he had no right to negotiate. In response, Arslan ordered his restraints to be removed and set up a feast, stating that he had something to discuss. Since Arslan could not drink alcohol, Farron and Jeev decided to drink on his behalf. After a while, Jeev got drunk and collapsed, while Farron remained composed, impressing Rajan. Returning to the negotiation, Arslan proposed an alliance. He would help Rajan claim the throne, and in return, Rajan would assist in military campaigns. Rajan accused Arslan of asking him to betray his own country, but Narcissus had already spread the news that Rajan had allied with them to seize the throne from his elder brother. Since Rajan was bound to challenge his brother anyway, they were merely accelerating the inevitable. With no other choice, Rajan was completely convinced and agreed to the alliance. Not long after, Rajan led his forces back to his homeland, accompanied by Arslan's group. Meanwhile, Rajan's elder brother, upon hearing that his younger sibling was rising to seize the throne, demanded the Chancellor take action. However, the Chancellor assured him that he had already planted a spy within Rajan's ranks, so the Crown Prince need not worry. Soon after, Rajan's army and Arslan's group encountered the first wave of attacks from his elder brother. Their forces quickly advanced and secured an easy victory. Arslan's troops then celebrated the new year in foreign lands. Arslan and Farron performed the ceremonial rites, after which the entire army gathered for a New Year's feast. Rajan stopped by to offer his New Year's greetings to Arslan, and then requested a favor. He proposed that Arslan split their troops into 2 divisions for the attack. However, upon discussing the plan, Daryan argued that Rajan was untrustworthy and was likely using them as bait to create the perfect opening for himself. Nonetheless, Narcissus still wanted Arslan to accept but added a condition: a guide must be assigned. The spy planted by the Chancellor was then sent over. Introducing himself as Jaswant, he soon pulled Arslan aside to kill a venomous snake that was about to bite him, explaining that although it was winter, the warmer climate in this area allowed snakes to remain active. As Jeev was leaving, he unexpectedly exchanged a few words with Jaswant and engaged in a brief martial arts sparring session. Jeev recognized that Jaswant possessed considerable combat skills before letting him go. Daryan, however, was unsure of Jeev's intentions behind this unexpected interaction. Not long after, the entire army arrived at a fortress, intending to seize it to facilitate their movements. Jeev and Jaswant were then sent into the fortress to negotiate. Jeev met with the fortress commander and requested passage into the country. However, the commander was concerned about being branded a traitor. Jeev argued that once Rajan ascended the throne, the commander would be rewarded for his actions. After considering the matter, the commander decided he needed time to think and had his attendants entertain the two. Later, Jaswant secretly approached the commander and revealed that he was an agent of the Grand Vizier. He proposed that the commander take advantage of the situation and sabotage the Parsian army. At that time, the Parsian army was planning to stealthily cross the fortress at night when the commander was off guard. However, since they could not win in a direct confrontation, Jaswant would signal the commander to attack the supply unit from behind. Jaswant then covertly followed the supply unit, preparing to give the signal, but Jeev noticed him. Jeev suspected that Narcissus had already been keeping an eye on Jaswant and had instructed him to monitor him. At that moment, Arslan's troops suddenly burst out from the supply wagons, launching a surprise attack just as the fortress commander, growing impatient, ordered an assault. Taken completely off guard, the commander's troops were annihilated. In a desperate attempt, the commander charged directly at Arslan, but Daryan hurled a spear into his back, killing him instantly. With their leader dead, his soldiers scattered in retreat. Meanwhile, Jeev finally unleashed his full strength, overpowering Jaswant. The following morning, Arslan interrogated Jaswant, who revealed that he only served the Grand Vizier because he had been an orphan, and the Vizier had raised him. He declared that he would never betray the man who had given him a home. Jeev wanted to execute him on the spot, but Arslan chose to let him go. Though Narcissus was well aware that this decision might bring consequences, he believed they would not be severe enough to warrant concern. That night, both Elam and Elfriede insisted on cooking for Narcissus, forcing him to compromise by eating dishes from both. Seeing Narcissus caught in his own set of troubles, Darian couldn't help but smirk. The two then discussed their plans for Arslan to ascend the throne within the next 10 years. However, both harbored doubts about whether Arslan truly had noble blood. Despite their uncertainties, they firmly believed that Arslan was the most worthy of becoming king and remained loyal to him. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince learned that Arslan's group had seized a fortress in just 3 days. Enraged, he decided to launch an immediate assault, intending to crush Arslan's forces with his war elephants. That night, Darian spotted Arslan climbing a tower, deep in thought. He urged Arslan to return to his room. At that moment, Arslan felt lost, questioning his own identity and doubting whether he truly belonged to the royal family. However, to Darian, Arslan was the most important person in his life. That was all that mattered. Before long, Elam arrived with urgent news. The Crown Prince had mobilized his forces and was advancing with his war elephants. At the same time, Rajan was moving to confront the prince's army before Arslan's group could. The problem they now faced was that the Crown Prince commanded an army of 150,000 men, while Rajan had only 50,000, and Arslan's forces numbered merely 20,000. The overwhelming difference in numbers posed a grave challenge. Even if they executed a pincer attack, the prince could simply divert a portion of his troops to hold them off while using his main force to crush Rajan. If that happened, the entire campaign would end in failure. Jaswant had since returned to the Crown Prince's camp, where he was reprimanded for his failure. However, the Grand Vizier stepped in to defend him, and the prince begrudgingly spared Jaswant this time. After the prince left, the Grand Vizier remarked that Jaswant's failure was due to the enemy's exceptional strategist. He also noted that the prince's lack of compassion would eventually cause him to lose the loyalty of his subordinates. Meanwhile, Darian received news that the Crown Prince had split his army into 2 forces, just as Narcissus had predicted. Though Arslan's side had a plan to counter this, Rajan's situation was much more precarious. Darian also worried about the future. If Arslan had to face Hermes again, would he truly be prepared? At the same time, Rajan and his brother confronted each other on an open plain, ready for battle. After exchanging taunts, the two sides began their advance. The Crown Prince's cavalry took the lead, successfully crossing the river to engage in combat. However, the infantry struggled to cross, gradually becoming separated from the cavalry. Thus, the elephants were unleashed to trample Rajan's army. Rajan ordered his archers to fire, but the arrows barely harmed the elephants. He couldn't understand how the elephants could fight in such a cold climate. He suspected they had been drugged into a frenzy. Just as Rajan wondered where Arslan's forces were, he received news that Arslan and the recently captured fortress had been surrounded by a detachment of the prince's army, preventing them from coming to his aid. However, just when Rajan had lost all hope, Arslan's forces arrived to support him. They rushed forward swiftly and met Rajan, revealing that the prince's army had actually been deceived into wasting time attacking an empty fortress. Even though Arslan's forces had reached Rajan, they still needed a strategy to counter the elephants. Darian believed they already had a way to deal with them. He then led his forces in a charge toward the elephants, but suddenly tightened their formation, turned around, and retreated. The elephants pursued them relentlessly. Jaswant urged the prince to halt the elephants, sensing something was wrong, but the prince, blinded by bloodlust, ignored him and continued the chase. This led the elephants straight into the massive ballista that had been set up. Narcissus explained that elephants were not agile creatures and were difficult to control. Additionally, they had specially crafted giant arrows capable of piercing the elephant's thick hide. Darian then charged forward, attacked the prince's elephant, and managed to overpower him. However, Jaswant rode in at full speed, rescued the prince, and escaped. Farron wanted to shoot them down, but once again, Arslan intervened. This victory was recorded in history. Meanwhile, the prince was furious, believing Jaswant had disgraced him by pulling him away. Soon after, news arrived that the father of the two princes had awakened. The crown prince immediately went to his father and reported that Rajan was plotting to seize the throne. He sought to persuade the king to name him as the rightful successor. However, the king knew his sons too well and instead announced that succession would be decided through a duel. The winner would inherit the throne. When Rajan heard this, he sought out Arslan for assistance. Since the duel allowed a champion to fight in one's stead, and since the prince would never fight for himself, he would surely appoint a substitute. Rajan's most trusted warrior at this moment was Daryun. However, Daryun stated that he only served Arslan, and unless Arslan ordered him, he would not fight. Rajan bowed his head and pleaded with Arslan for help, leaving Arslan with no choice but to agree. Arslan then requested Daryun's aid, and Daryun had no choice but to accept. Daryun and Narcissus suspected that the prince would also choose a formidable warrior, but they were more preoccupied with thoughts about Arslan's true lineage. Nevertheless, Daryun was willing to serve Arslan regardless of his origins. When the prince heard that Daryun would be fighting, he was enraged. Left with no alternative, he unchained a deranged criminal, a monstrous beast of a man, to serve as his champion. Soon after, Arslan's forces arrived at the capital, where they noticed the townspeople were not particularly welcoming. It was understandable, as this place had never hosted foreign visitors. Eventually, they reached the arena where the duel would take place. Arslan had the opportunity to meet Rajan's father, and shortly after, Daryun stepped onto the battlefield. On the other side, the monstrous warrior emerged, breaking past the guards and stepping forward. He shattered his chains, grabbed a massive axe, and entered the arena. When Arslan asked Rajan about this warrior, Rajan reassured him that Daryun would be fine. Meanwhile, the monstrous fighter only hoped Daryun wouldn't die too quickly. As the battle began, the brute launched a relentless assault, quickly knocking away Daryun's shield. However, Daryun counterattacked, managing to land a slash on the beast. Unfortunately, the wound was not deep enough, and the monster continued his furious assault. Farron admitted that this opponent truly was a beast in human form. While Daryun might be invincible against men, against such a monster, she wasn't sure. Even so, she urged Arslan to remain calm. The monstrous beast continued to swing relentlessly at Daryun's sword, eventually breaking it in two. One powerful blow knocked off Daryun's helmet. Although Daryun was in a dire situation, Narcissus remained calm. Daryun continued to dodge the beast's attacks and managed to stab him in the back. However, the beast retaliated with a powerful kick, sending Daryun flying to the edge of the arena. His weapon was lost, and Arslan grew frantic. He confronted Rajan, vowing that if anything happened to Daryun, he would take Rajan's head and the beast's as punishment, swearing before the gods. But the king defended Rajan, stating that the prince had released the beast from prison after hearing that Daryun would represent Rajan. He also told the prince that had he cared for his trusted officers like Arslan, he might have been crowned king long ago. The prince acknowledged this advice, as now nothing stood in his way of seizing the throne. At that moment, Narcissus gestured to Daryun to act immediately. The beast charged at Daryun, but Daryun threw a burning cloak into its face. The prince, desperate to see his champion win, tried to rush in to stop Daryun, but Daryun drew a dagger and stabbed the beast in the neck, killing it. The king declared Daryun the victor. Narcissus noted that Daryun had deliberately distracted the beast and hid a short sword on his person, using it to his advantage. However, the prince suddenly changed his stance and refused to accept the result. He drew his sword and demanded that the king relinquish the throne. He also ordered his men to attack, forcing Rajan to take action. Arslan's group quickly left, as they no longer wanted to get involved in the conflict between the two brothers. But the prince's soldiers still targeted them, and just as Arslan was about to be attacked, Jaswant arrived to save him. He explained that this was an internal matter and that if foreign royalty interfered, it would be a disgrace to the country. The prime minister advised the prince to accept the defeat, but he refused, even going so far as to kill the prime minister, leaving the soldiers speechless. Daryun challenged anyone dissatisfied with the result to step forward and fight him. All the soldiers were persuaded by Daryun's words. Rajan declared that the prince had broken the laws of the kingdom, and anyone who supported him would be considered a traitor. No one dared speak up, so Rajan ordered the prince's arrest, as he was now nothing more than a murderer. Jaswant then rushed to the prime minister, who believed this was the result of choosing the wrong person to serve. He hoped Jaswant would not follow his path and then passed away. Shortly after, the king fell ill once more, aware that his time was near. He hoped his two sons would no longer fight, and he asked Rajan to forgive his brother. Rajan promised, and soon after, the king passed away. His funeral was quickly organized, and many people attended, showing the king's success in his rule. Rajan, although crying in front of the king, was thought by most to be pretending, but Narcissus believed his tears were real. Not long after, Jaswant was freed and brought to meet Arslan. Arslan asked him what he planned to do now, and Jaswant replied that this place no longer belonged to him. Arslan then invited him to join him. However, Rajan later came to invite Arslan to a banquet that evening. Arslan wasn't sure of the banquet's purpose, but that night, the appearance of the former crown prince provided the answer. Narcissus explained that it was the prince's final meal before his execution. The prince then knelt before Rajan, begging for his life, but Rajan was determined not to let him live. When the prince saw Arslan, he shattered a vase and used a shard to try and attack him. But Kishward's eagle intervened, blinding the prince in one eye. Rajan, not wanting to let the prince live and disrupt the banquet, ordered his immediate execution. The next day, the prince's head was displayed outside the palace as a reminder to the people. Having helped Rajan ascend to the throne, he now wanted to return the favor by helping Arslan reclaim his kingdom. He suggested lending Arslan 500 cavalry. He appeared generous and offered to lend 3,000 soldiers if Arslan wanted them. Arslan had no choice but to accept, but when he left, Rajan revealed his true deceitful nature. Rajan had informed his trusted men that the 3,000 soldiers would temporarily serve as spies to monitor Arslan's movements. Once Arslan let his guard down, Rajan would teach him a lesson. However, Jaswant overheard this plan. Not long after, Arslan's group set off to return to their country. They were pleased to have Rajan's 3,000 soldiers accompanying them, and the commanders of this force followed their orders without question. But that night, Rajan secretly launched an attack and invaded Arslan's camp. Once again, Rajan fell into a trap and was ambushed by Arslan's forces. The commander of the 3,000 cavalry was captured, and Rajan was surrounded by Arslan's entire group of trusted men. He had no idea how they had discovered his plan, but Jaswant revealed himself. Rajan had no choice but to surrender and allow himself to be bound. Arslan then informed him that he would not take his life, but would instead take him to Pars for 2 years. However, Narcissus wanted to be more forceful and suggested sending letters informing neighboring countries of Rajan's absence. Rajan was terrified, as the neighboring countries had been eyeing his kingdom for a long time, and if he were gone for 2 years, he might not have a kingdom to return to. Therefore, Arslan proposed that Rajan sign a 3-year non-aggression pact. With no other choice, Rajan agreed and left. Alfred wondered why they didn't force Rajan to sign a longer pact, but Narcissus explained that Rajan wouldn't be able to wait that long. They would only pressure him for 3 years, during which time they must reclaim the kingdom. Arslan realized that Rajan had played him like this because he had been too weak, and despite the betrayal, Arslan couldn't bring himself to hate Rajan. Jaswant then told Arslan that if war broke out between his country and Pars, he would stand with his homeland. But since Arslan had saved his life several times, he would serve Arslan until the conflict with Rajan occurred. Thus, Arslan gained another loyal companion, and the focus of the conflict shifted back to Pars. Not long after, Guiz learned that Bodin had seized an important fortress and was holding it, intending to execute the king and queen and force the king of the Holy Kingdom to repent for his foolish mistakes. Guiz did not want to follow Bodin's orders and decided to take back the fortress. Sam, now a subordinate of Hermes, decided to ask Hermes to take the mission of recapturing the fortress and rebuilding Pars with Hermes as its ruler. Hermes admitted that it was the best course of action. Sam then visited the former king of Pars in prison to ask if he had been the one to kill his brother and Hermes. However, the former king responded that even if Sam knew the truth, it wouldn't matter. Sam didn't have much time to pressure the king, so he left. Meanwhile, Hermes went to meet Guiz to ask for permission to handle the Bodin situation. Guiz agreed and informed his subordinates that even if Hermes had some hidden agenda, it was better for him to deal with Bodin and take the losses than to handle the matter personally. Soon, Hermes had gathered an army of 10,000 soldiers and set out to deal with Bodin and reclaim the fortress. While asking the locals about the situation, Sam learned that some knights of the Temple Order had disguised themselves as bandits to exploit the people. One of them, a one-eyed man, had stepped forward to deal with them. After hearing the description, Sam guessed who it was and requested permission from Hermes to recruit this person. The man was Cubard, who had once served in Shapur but had since been captured. Cubard no longer served anyone and was living a life of wandering, indulging in alcohol and women. However, Sam invited him to serve Hermes, the true king of Pars. Not long after, Hermes' army arrived at the fortress occupied by Bodin and burned the holy flag to provoke him. Bodin, known for his temper, immediately led his forces into battle. At this point, it was revealed that Xander was still alive, and Sam had divided his forces to prepare for the attack. After one day of fighting, Bodin's forces lost 2,000 men, and the remaining soldiers decided to fortify themselves within the fortress. However, Cubard met with Hermes and asked what his plans were once he regained the throne. Hermes stated that he wanted to bring peace and reclaim the lost throne. Cubard, however, decided not to participate anymore because he wanted to continue living freely as he had been. Hermes did not press him and allowed Cubard to leave with a reward for his role in the battle. Cubard later told Sam that the reason he refused to join was because he knew there would inevitably be a civil war between Arslan and Hermes. What surprised him was that someone who hated the court system, like Narcissus, was following Arslan. Not long after, Narcissus drafted 2 proclamations. The first was to expel the Holy Kingdom from the capital, and the second was to abolish slavery. Thanks to these proclamations, Arslan would now be known as the Liberator. Once Arslan overcame his weaknesses, he would become a figure remembered in history. Due to these declarations, many lords began to rally behind Arslan to help expel the invaders. Narcissus was surprised by the large number of people who chose to follow Arslan, especially one lord named Lucian, who was not a typical mercenary. That night, Narcissus sensed that having so many lords gathering together could create problems, and the first issue arose when Jaswant had a disagreement with one of the lords. The two were about to fight when Kishward stepped in to stop them. Arslan had to find Narcissus immediately to resolve the issue. Narcissus believed the problem stemmed from Arslan surrounding himself with people of low social status. The first step, according to Narcissus, was for Arslan to strip him of his title as High Priest, a position reserved for older, more experienced individuals. Narcissus believed that he should only handle the military, and Arslan should appoint Lord Lucian as the new High Priest, as Lucian was considered a reasonable person who would assist them in their plan. Lucian was then called to meet Arslan, where they informed him of Hermes' current efforts to build his forces to reclaim the kingdom. However, they could not allow Hermes to take the throne because he had allied with the Holy Kingdom, which had led to the country's downfall. Lucian, after hearing this, decided to oppose Hermes' claim to the throne and promised to support Arslan. Arslan had heard rumors that the king had been the one who killed Hermes' father and took the throne, so he understood why Hermes might seek revenge. Arslan decided that he would focus on liberating the people first before dealing with other matters. Narcissus later discussed with Darion that Arslan was still too young to bear such heavy responsibilities. They could not deny that Arslan might eventually hand the throne to Hermes to atone for his father's sins. Therefore, they needed to show Arslan the value and responsibility of the throne so that he wouldn't give it away so easily. Meanwhile, Hermes and his forces had completely taken over the fortress, and Bodin, along with the others, had fled. Hermes felt pity for them, as they had been abandoned by their own gods and commanders. During this time, Itoy noticed that she was unfit to be the leader of her unit because too many people were speaking ill of her behind her back. Recognizing that their criticisms were not unfounded, Itoy revealed her true identity as a woman and secretly left the ranks to patrol. She was eventually taken in by a merchant who employed her to serve wine to the soldiers. Itoy later snuck into the feast that Arslan's troops were holding and poured wine for the soldiers. She realized that the Pars forces would soon rise up, but still believed that the Holy Kingdom could not be defeated. After leaving the feast and muttering to herself, Itoy was spotted by Alfred, who explained that he had no place at the feast either, so he had sneaked out. Alfred then spoke about his fondness for Narcissus, which Itoy misunderstood as implying that Pars was abducting young women to make them wives, which she saw as a disgrace. The soldier whom Itoy had served wine to earlier approached her, attempting to flirt, but Itoy quickly knocked him out. Arslan accidentally saw Etoy, and Etoy was surprised that Arslan was still alive. She also noticed that Arslan didn't recognize her, so they both dragged the soldier they had just knocked out into a corner. Arslan then decided to help Etoy leave without being noticed by the soldiers. Jeeves saw them and hoped the goddess of love would guide him. Arslan then took Etoy to the city walls and they talked for a while. Arslan asked why Etoy was here, and she lied, saying that her family was in need, so she had to earn money. When Arslan offered to help, she refused. Etoy asked why someone like Arslan was here, and Arslan revealed that he was preparing to join the battle to reclaim his homeland. He also shared that Etoy was the one who had given him the motivation and helped him understand the world, showing him the good and bad of his country. Because of that, he wanted to change the country for the better. Etoy was surprised by how mature Arslan had become, no longer the weak person she had once known. She told him he should be proud of who he was, which gave Arslan the determination he needed to carry on. Arslan then took Etoy out of the city, helping her escape by using a merchant's cart. Etoy realized she had forgotten to ask Arslan's name, but hoped they would meet again on the battlefield. The next day, Arslan met with his trusted subordinates and declared that he would not hand the throne to Hermes, even though Hermes was the true heir. Arslan believed that he had to become king to have the authority to free the slaves, a decree that had just been approved. He hoped they would support him in this journey. Everyone knelt before him, vowing to make his dream a reality. A few days later, thanks to Lucian handling the role of high priest, Narcissus had more time to focus on military matters. He and Darion later witnessed a quarrel between Jaswant and a nobleman named Zara, the son of a lord. Zara was unhappy that he had to serve under Darion and couldn't prove himself on the front lines. Jeev intervened, asking both sides to stop arguing and listen to him play his lute. Narcissus then promised to find a satisfactory resolution for Zara, who, out of respect for Narcissus, agreed to leave. Zara believed Arslan was putting too many suspicious people in important positions. Narcissus then went off to think of a plan to solve the current discord. Meanwhile, Cubard, who was on his way to Kishward's fortress, was discovered by Xander's men. They assumed Cubard was plotting against Hermes and intended to deal with him. Cubard, in turn, apologized, knowing he would eventually have to face Sam. During this time, Jeev encountered Esfin, Shapur's younger brother. Esfin was resentful of Jeev for killing Shapur and believed Jeev should be held responsible for his death. Jeev, however, explained that he had merely freed Shapur from his suffering. The two then fought, and many people sided with Esfin. Jeev, however, stated that he had always been by Arslan's side, helping him, unlike the others. Farron had to step in and stop the fight, as Arslan had arrived. Darion believed that Jeev had provoked Esfin, and Jeev mocked Darion in return. Arslan, deciding he could not let this continue, decided to expel Jeev. Jeev, unbothered, wished Arslan success and left. However, this was part of Narcissus' plan. Narcissus needed Jeev to play the role of the villain to help ease tensions for a while. Jeev left, but Narcissus had asked him to find someone who would help Arslan ascend to the throne. A few days later, Arslan's army began their march to reclaim the capital. Guis, upon hearing the news, gathered all the scattered troops across Pars and brought them to the capital. Hermes, however, didn't care, knowing that sooner or later he would march back to take Arslan's head. Guis would continue to manipulate Hermes as long as he could. Meanwhile, Arslan's army set up camp and planned to take the next fortress. The fortress had a narrow path that could be used to attack, but they decided not to waste time on it and would attack the fortress directly instead. Zara, Esfin, and another person named Tuss requested to take the narrow path for Arslan. However, Arslan refused, stating that he didn't want to waste manpower on a pointless fight. The next day, during the march, Zara, eager to prove himself, led his troops forward. Esfin also wanted to earn credit, and Tuss couldn't back down either. The three of them took a few thousand men into the narrow path, only to be ambushed and trapped with no way to retreat. Arslan soon heard the news, and Narcissus gave him two choices. One was to go save them, and the other was to abandon them. Of course, saving them would be difficult, but Arslan decided to send scouts ahead before sending a rescue team. However, when Alayam and Elfried returned from scouting, they reported that it was too dark and there was no moon. But then, the sound of Jeev's lute unexpectedly echoed through the night, guiding Arslan's way. Thanks to this, just when Zara, Esfen, and Tus were surrounded and on the brink of sacrifice, Arslan led his troops to rescue them. The three of them then asked why Arslan didn't abandon them, to which he replied that this battle would be brutal, and he needed all the resources he could get. Meanwhile, Farron went to say goodbye to Jeev and to relay a message from Arslan. Jeev played a piece of music, hoping that Farron would remember it after he left. At the same time, Hermes received the news that Arslan was on his way to reclaim the capital, so he decided to intercept him. Guiz, hearing that Arslan was bringing 60,000 troops, suspected that the number might be inflated, so he prepared 100,000 men to engage in battle. Although it was a large number, Guiz didn't want to be complacent, as it was possible that the 60,000 was an underestimation, and the actual number could be much higher. When Hermes returned, he claimed that he had 30,000 men and wanted to borrow an additional 70,000 troops from Guiz to defeat Arslan. Guiz agreed to lend them but insisted that Hermes would have to return them later. Hermes reluctantly left, still frustrated by the disrespect he had faced from the others. In the meantime, Elam and Alfred had been gathering information in the capital. They were discovered by the soldiers, so they had to pretend to be a couple on the run to avoid suspicion. They entered a tavern where the soldiers were gathering and learned that the Holy Kingdom's soldiers were irritated with Xander and Sam's men, who were boasting after capturing Baden's fortress. They also overheard that Hermes was preparing to lead 100,000 men to continue the fight, so they quickly left. That night, Hermes visited the king to inform him that Arslan was coming to rescue him. However, the king dismissed it, saying he wasn't so pathetic as to need his son to save him. What the king didn't know was how obsessed Hermes was with this task, even willing to collaborate with the enemy and shed the blood of his own people. The king told Hermes that he had appeared in a prophecy, something Hermes was unaware of. Hermes, determined, vowed that the next time, he would bring Arslan's head as a gift for the king. The king only smiled lightly as Hermes left. The next day, Hermes began marching with his troops, while Arslan's group learned that Sam was also part of Hermes' army. Narcissus would soon come up with a plan to deal with this. The following day, Arslan practiced sword fighting with Daryan, catching the attention of the new recruits. He then asked Daryan and several commanders to teach the recruits how to use weapons skillfully to help in the upcoming battle. Narcissus noticed that Daryan still had doubts about Arslan's decisions, but if Daryan refused to serve Hermes, he should place his trust in Arslan. That night, Arslan met with Narcissus, who knew that Arslan was concerned about the soldiers. Most of the infantry were former slaves, so they lacked much combat experience. But instead of just fighting and being dependent on orders, Arslan decided to give them training that they could join voluntarily, which would help them feel like fully free individuals. Meanwhile, Alfred thought that Farron might feel a bit lonely after Jeev's departure. However, Farron didn't feel that way, as her god had told her that even if Jeev left, his heart would always be with Arslan. Arslan's army soon reached the fortress they were aiming for. It had once been an abandoned stronghold, but the Holy Kingdom had captured and repurposed it. The fortress was commanded by Barca, who had been sheltering Itoy all this time. Itoy was upset about having to cooperate with Par's soldiers and Hermes this time, but Barca explained that Guiz needed them to stop the enemy from advancing any further, and Itoy should see this as a challenge they needed to overcome. The next day, both armies were ready for the upcoming battle. That morning, Hermes stood up to boost the morale of the Holy Kingdom's army, secretly smiling to himself as he realized how easily these devout followers could be manipulated. On Arslan's side, he had chosen those who would go to the battlefield and lay siege to the city. However, when they arrived at the battlefield, many of the soldiers began to lose heart because Sam was on the opposing side. Sam had always been famous for his exceptional defensive skills, but Arslan was determined to fight until the end. At that moment, Itoy arrived to ask Barca if she could join the front lines. She didn't want to stay in the back anymore and wanted to help in the fight against the heathens. Alfred also wanted to fight on the front lines. Farron remembered that Alfred belonged to the Zat tribe, a nomadic group that didn't recognize the Par's royal family but was now helping Arslan. Alfred, however, simply felt that Arslan was going to do something interesting. Farron also thought that Arslan was still too young for such responsibilities, but Arslan proved that he could handle it. Meanwhile, the siege troops on Arslan's side were showing signs of exhaustion, so Xander's cavalry unit went into battle. But Daryan's cavalry was also ready to deploy. Zara and Jaswant set aside their grudges and fought together. Arslan, meanwhile, hoped that Kishward's forces were also doing well. Kishward was leading an attack on the underground tunnels when Sam stopped them. Kishward quickly charged into battle and confronted Sam for helping Hermes, a man who was blindly chasing the throne and betraying his own people. Sam, however, believed that while Hermes might be blinded now, he would eventually become a great king. Kishward, on the other hand, would never accept a king like that. At that time, Hermes received the report about the battle lines, especially that Xander was acting on his own. Qbard also arrived at the battlefield and engaged in combat with the Holy Kingdom's forces. For Itoy, even though she was fighting, it seemed like it was the first time she had spilled blood. Itoy was knocked off her horse and discovered Alam nearby, so she decided to follow him. Meanwhile, Xander charged directly into the heart of Arslan's formation, targeting the camp in the rear. But when he attacked, it turned out to be a decoy camp created by Narcissus. This was part of the strategy to lure the enemy into a trap, a tactic that Narcissus had taught Arslan. Xander's troops were ambushed and wiped out. Xander managed to escape, only to encounter Darion. Darion acknowledged that Xander was indeed very tough, but he still wanted revenge for his father. He believed that once Hermes ascended the throne, Carlin would be exonerated because Carlin had known the true king and helped Hermes reclaim the throne. As for Kishward, he didn't want to fight Sam, but Sam insisted that both of them had their own paths to follow. One forest cannot have two tigers, and one country cannot have two kings. Sam was then disarmed, but his soldiers protected him. The enemy closed in, trapping Kishward. Darion, feeling regret, thought that if he and Xander had served the same master, they could have been allies. Darion then charged with Xander, delivering a final blow. Thanks to his lighter spear, Darion struck first, knocking Xander down. However, a wizard appeared and made Xander's body vanish. Meanwhile, Arslan discovered that his camp had been found, and the one who had located it was Itoy. Itoy didn't expect to encounter Arslan there, but she believed she had come to take his life. Arslan then revealed that he was the one she was looking for. Itoy charged at Arslan, but Elam stepped in to protect him. Elam was injured, and Itoy decided to retreat when she saw that they were about to be surrounded. Itoy and her soldiers withdrew, and Narcissus asked Alfred to follow Itoy and find the secret passage into the fortress. Elam was not seriously hurt, but Itoy was shocked to realize how long she had been deceived. Alfred continued to pursue her. That night, Darion returned, and Arslan recounted the person he had spared back then. Darion remembered Itoy, and now he was determined to join the battle to rally the troops' morale. Arslan knew that he could never be like his father, the king, but he still wanted to do everything he could. Narcissus later received a report from Alfred's people, saying she would open the gate for them at dawn. Arslan then gave a speech to raise the morale of his troops, which inspired them to charge toward the fortress. As dawn broke, Alfred's forces stormed the gate and began their attack on the castle to open the gates for the troops outside. She and her soldiers helped several people open the gate. From the outside, the trio Tus, Esfin, and Zara also assisted Alfred's group, and once the gates opened, they rushed in to cause chaos. This allowed Arslan's forces to quickly advance and pour into the castle. The moment Darion led the cavalry through the castle walls, it marked the beginning of the real chaos for the Holy Kingdom's army. Arslan's forces pushed deeper into the city but were soon surrounded on both sides. Qbard suddenly charged in to support Arslan from behind. He chose to join Arslan's side and urged him not to disappoint him. The army continued to push forward but was forced to dismount due to the scaffolding blocking their way. Hermes, however, didn't care about how many soldiers of the Holy Kingdom were lost. As long as he could defeat Arslan, he would claim victory. They soon faced Sam, and Narcissus stayed behind to fight, allowing Darion to escort Arslan into the castle. They were then blocked by a group of archers, but Farron stepped forward, claiming that the arrows of the wicked would never touch her, for she was blessed by the gods. Arslan and Darion continued their advance and finally confronted Hermes. Hermes declared that no matter how far Arslan went, he would die there by his hand, but Arslan offered him a chance to join him in his journey to become a true king. He couldn't abdicate because of his responsibility to those who supported him. At this point, Sam decided to retreat to assist Hermes, and Darion stepped forward to confront him. The two left the battlefield for their duel. Meanwhile, Barker recognized that Arslan might indeed be a good king. But he regretted that if the Holy Kingdom could make an exception for a heathen like Arslan, things wouldn't have come to this. Darion and Hermes fought fiercely outside, and after several clashes of swords, they found themselves in a final standoff, both ready to strike. They were both injured, but a wizard appeared and took Hermes away, making his escape. Arslan's forces completely captured the fortress, but Kishward didn't want his soldiers to behave savagely or loot anything. However, the nuns of the fortress tower suddenly threw themselves off the tower. Arslan told Barca to stop them, but he had similar intentions, pulling out a knife to end his own life for failing in his duties. Arslan tried to stop him but couldn't, and Barca ended his life by jumping from the tower. At that moment, Itoy arrived, believing that Arslan had killed Barca, and charged at him. Arslan then recognized that she was the girl from that night. He tried to explain, but Itoy didn't want to listen. She accused him of deceiving her and taking away the person she respected most. However, Farron returned with her soldiers and subdued Itoy. The battle ended, and Barca, along with the devout followers of the Holy Kingdom, chose to commit suicide to stay true to their faith. The wounded were taken care of by Arslan's forces, and those who surrendered and no longer wished to fight were spared. Arslan later found Darion and learned that Hermes had escaped. Narcissus then imprisoned the prisoners and gave them a few beds. He also asked the soldiers if they knew where Alfred's group was, and she unexpectedly fell from the food storage. She was surprised to be alive and didn't know why Narcissus was there. He explained that he was occupying the food storage. Jaswant then tended to Darion's wounds, and Kishward wondered why Hermes hadn't finished Darion off. Darion speculated that Hermes might be toying with him and likely had some hidden agenda. Meanwhile, Farron was drinking with Cubard, and Arslan visited Itoy, who had calmed down after learning the truth about Barca's death. Both Arslan and Itoy admitted that Barca was a truly kind man who didn't belong on the battlefield. Arslan brought food to Itoy and persuaded her to eat, wanting to hear her story. She told him that she had abandoned her old name because she was adopted by a family of knights. Since that family had no heirs, she changed her name and became a knight. Arslan then asked her if there was any way to stop the war from continuing. He admitted to having read every word of the Bible she gave him, acknowledging that it was good for teaching people, but that the rulers were using it to manipulate devout people like her into slaughtering others. The opposing ideals led Itoy to no longer want to argue and told Arslan to leave. However, Arslan asked her to come and pray for the fallen soldiers the next day and to leave the door open. If she wanted to escape, she was free to do so, but the next day, Itoy still came to pray with Arslan. Meanwhile, Hermes returned to meet Guiz. He revealed his true identity and proposed an alliance with Guiz, knowing that Guiz wasn't fond of Pars. Guiz laid his cards on the table and asked Hermes to help him overthrow his brother, so that he could become the king of the Holy Kingdom. In return, he promised to hand over the throne of Pars to Hermes. Meanwhile, Arslan's army continued their march, burning down the fortress to prevent bandits from using it as a base. The prisoners from the Holy Kingdom were given time before being released, to avoid a shortage of food. Itoy followed along to tend to the wounded, and Aleum had to help as Itoy seemed to be of little use other than in battle. One night, as they made camp, Itoy went to fetch water to care for a pregnant woman. She had a brief conversation with Farron and learned why everyone followed Arslan. Even though she heard everything, Itoy pretended not to understand. That evening, Arslan went to find Itoy to return the Bible. Itoy thought that Arslan was being reckless and disrespecting his own life by coming to a place like this. They moved to a corner to talk, and Itoy refused to take the Bible back from him. Not long after, the pregnant woman gave birth to a child. No matter which god they worshipped, everyone hoped that the child would have a bright future. As for Arslan, he didn't expect his difficult journey to have reached such a point, but he knew it was still too early to be confident. Meanwhile, Jeev was searching for evidence of Arslan's legitimate claim to the throne. And so, the story of the boy who would be known as the Liberator and would become a prince at only 15 years old had to be paused here. Farewell.